The flashing red and blue lights cut through the late evening haze, reflecting off the rain-slick pavement. Malcolm Carter tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against his dark skin. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The police cruiser loomed behind him like a predator closing in on its prey. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. Stay calm. Keep your hands visible. The siren gave a short, sharp wail before going silent. Malcolm exhaled slowly, his mind racing through every possible reason for the stop. He wasn't speeding. His taillights worked. His registration was up to date. A sharp rap on the driver's side window made him jump. He turned his head and found himself staring at the stern face of Officer Bradley, a cop he'd seen around town before. His presence had always made Malcolm uneasy. There was something about the man's gaze, something cold, assessing, as if he were always looking for an excuse. Malcolm rolled down his window, keeping his hands in sight. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Bradley didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked over Malcolm's face, then down to the dashboard. "License and registration." His voice was clipped, mechanical. Malcolm nodded and reached for his wallet, moving slowly. He knew how these situations could spiral out of control in an instant. He handed over his license and retrieved the registration from the glove compartment. The officer barely glanced at them before stepping back. "Step out of the vehicle." Malcolm frowned. "Excuse me?" "I said step out." The officer's tone was firmer now, leaving no room for argument. Malcolm hesitated. His pulse quickened. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew refusing could escalate things fast. With a measured breath, he unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed open the door. The damp air hit him as he stepped onto the asphalt, the tension thick between them. Bradley motioned toward the side of the road. Hands on the hood. A prickle of unease crawled up Malcolm's spine. "Officer, can I ask why I'm being stopped?" Bradley's expression remained unreadable. Suspicion of vehicle theft. Malcolm's stomach dropped. "What? This is my car." "We got a report about a stolen vehicle matching this description," Bradley said flatly. Malcolm exhaled sharply. "That's a mistake. I have my registration right there." Bradley didn't seem to hear him. He reached for his radio, speaking into it in hushed tones. A second cruiser pulled up behind the first, and another officer stepped out. This one was younger, his features tense but uncertain. "Cuff him," Bradley instructed. Panic flared in Malcolm's chest. "Hold on, what are you doing?" The younger officer hesitated. "Sir, please turn around." Malcolm's hands clenched at his sides. He looked between the two officers, searching for a sliver of reason. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You haven't even run my plates." Bradley smirked, the first hint of emotion cracking through his otherwise impassive face. "Plates can be swapped. We'll sort it out at the station." The younger officer stepped forward, reaching for his cuffs. Malcolm took a step back, his pulse hammering. "Don't," he said, his voice lower now. Bradley's hand hovered near his holster. "Are you resisting, Mr. Carter?" Malcolm froze. One wrong move, and this could go south fast. He knew how these stories ended. The headlines played in his mind like a grim prophecy. Unarmed black man shot during routine traffic stop. His breath came quick and shallow. He forced himself to inhale slowly, to push the fear down. "I'm not resisting," he said, raising his hands, his voice calm but edged with frustration. "I just want to know why I'm being treated like a criminal." Bradley chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "If you're innocent, you've got nothing to worry about." The younger officer stepped behind Malcolm, looping the cold metal around his wrists. The click of the cuffs felt like the snap of a trap. Malcolm's world tilted. A murmur of voices. The crackle of the police radio. A gust of wind cutting through his jacket. It all blurred together as the weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. This wasn't just about tonight. It wasn't just about this traffic stop. It was about something bigger. Something he had spent his whole life trying to outrun. And now, it had caught up to him. The station smelled like stale coffee and bleach. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly glow over the gray walls. Malcolm sat stiffly on the metal bench, his wrists still aching from the too tight handcuffs. He'd been here for nearly an hour, waiting. Watching. Across the room, Officer Bradley leaned against a desk, chatting with another officer like this was just another routine night. Malcolm's wallet and keys sat in a plastic evidence bag on the counter. His phone had been taken the moment he arrived, leaving him cut off from the outside world. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Don't panic. Stay calm." A door creaked open. A woman in a neatly pressed uniform stepped in. Sergeant Lisa Garrett. Malcolm recognized her. He'd seen her name in the news before, one of the department's so-called reformers. A black woman in a precinct full of men like Bradley. Maybe, just maybe, she'd be the one to listen. She approached the bench, clipboard in hand, and met his eyes. "Mr. Carter." He sat up straighter. "Yes." She scanned the paperwork, then looked at him again. "Officer Bradley brought you in on suspicion of vehicle theft." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "This is my car. The registration is in my glove compartment. I told him that." She sighed through her nose. "He claims the vehicle matches the description of a stolen car reported earlier tonight. Did anyone bother checking my registration?" Malcolm asked, irritation creeping into his voice. She hesitated, just for a second. "No. They hadn't checked." Malcolm let out a short, humorless laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." Garrett didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned toward Bradley, who was still leaned against the desk, watching them with a smirk. "Bradley, did you verify his registration?" Bradley shrugged. "Plates were close enough to the stolen vehicle report. Figured we'd bring him in first, sort it out here." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "That's not protocol." Bradley's expression didn't change. "We had probable cause." Garrett turned back to Malcolm. Her expression softened, but there was something guarded in her eyes. Like she wanted to help but knew the weight of the system pressing down on her. "I'll check the registration myself," she said, stepping toward the desk. Bradley's smirk disappeared. "That necessary, Sergeant?" Garrett shot him a look. "Are you questioning me?" Bradley held up his hands in mock surrender. "Of course not." Malcolm watched as Garrett made a call, her voice low and professional. Minutes passed. The tension in the room thickened. Then, she turned back to him. "This is your vehicle," she said, her voice measured. "You shouldn't have been brought in." Malcolm's chest tightened, a mix of relief and anger bubbling under his skin. "Then I can go?" Garrett hesitated. "Not yet." A new wave of frustration crashed over him. "What do you mean, not yet?" Bradley pushed off the desk, stepping closer with an almost casual air. "We still need to process the paperwork." Malcolm clenched his fists. "So let me get this straight. You arrest me without cause, ignore my registration, and now you're telling me I have to sit here and wait because of paperwork?" Bradley's smirk returned. "That's how the system works, Mr. Carter." The way he said it, slow, deliberate, sent a shiver through Malcolm's spine. Garrett's jaw tightened. "We'll expedite it." Bradley chuckled. "Sure. Expedite it." The words were simple, but Malcolm heard the meaning behind them. They weren't in a hurry to let him go. Garrett turned back to Malcolm. "I'll do what I can." She walked away, disappearing into an office down the hall. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Malcolm alone with Bradley and the other officers. Bradley leaned against the counter, tapping his fingers on the surface. "You seem upset," he said, mock concern dripping from his voice. Malcolm exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay still. "I want my phone call." Bradley tilted his head, pretending to think. "Yeah. I don't think we got to that yet." "That's my right." Bradley's smile widened. "Sure. And you'll get it. Eventually." Malcolm's fingers curled into fists. He could see it now, the game they were playing. It wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about power. About making him sit here, making him feel small. Bradley took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You see, guys like you always think you can outsmart the system. You think you're owed something." Malcolm's breath came slow and measured. He refused to take the bait. Bradley smirked again. "I'd get comfortable if I were you. Could be a long night." Malcolm stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. He had spent his whole life following the rules. Doing everything right. And still, here he was. He wasn't going to let them break him. The hours dragged. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness, each second stretching into eternity. Malcolm sat on the cold metal bench, muscles stiff, mind racing. No phone call. No explanation. Just silence, punctuated by the occasional laugh from the officers across the room. Officer Bradley hadn't spoken again, but his presence was a constant pressure, like a weight pressing down on Malcolm's chest. Every so often, he'd glance over, smirking, tapping a pen against the desk, waiting for Malcolm to crack. But Malcolm wouldn't give him the satisfaction. A door creaked open. Sergeant Garrett reappeared, her expression unreadable. "You're free to go." The word should have brought relief, but Malcolm stayed still, wary. Garrett sighed. "Your registration checked out, and the actual stolen vehicle was found across town. You were brought in without cause." She shot a look at Bradley before turning back to Malcolm. "I've made sure it's documented." Malcolm slowly rose to his feet, blood rushing back into his legs. "That's it?" Garrett nodded. "That's it." He let out a slow breath. His shoulders ached from hours of tension. He was free, but the anger remained, simmering beneath his skin. Garrett motioned toward the desk. "We'll return your belongings, and you can Bradley stood, holding Malcolm's wallet and keys in one hand, twirling them slightly. "Oh, almost forgot. You were also cited for failure to comply during a traffic stop." Malcolm froze. "What?" Garrett's head snapped toward Bradley. "That's not." Bradley cut her off. "When asked to exit your vehicle, you hesitated. That's obstruction." He held out a small slip of paper. A citation. A fine. A mark on Malcolm's record. Garrett's eyes darkened. "This is ridiculous, Bradley." Bradley's smirk never faded. "He's free to contest it. The court date's on the back." Malcolm stared at the paper, his fists clenching. It wasn't about the fine. It was about control. A final, petty move to remind him where he stood. His voice was steady, but his anger was razor-sharp. "You can't stand that I'm walking out of here." Bradley's smirk twitched. Just a little. Malcolm snatched his wallet and keys from Bradley's hand, his grip tight. Garrett sighed. "Let's go." She led him toward the exit, her pace brisk, as if she wanted him out before anything escalated further. The moment they stepped outside, the crisp night air hit Malcolm's face. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself. Garrett turned to him. "I know this was wrong. If you file a complaint, I'll back you up." Malcolm let out a short laugh. "And then what? Bradley gets a slap on the wrist?" Her silence was answer enough. Malcolm shook his head. "I'm tired of playing by the rules. The rules don't work." Garrett studied him, then nodded slowly. "I get it." Malcolm looked down at the citation in his hand. It wasn't just a fine, it was a challenge. A warning. A message that they could come for him anytime they wanted. He'd spent his life trying to stay out of trouble. But trouble had found him anyway. And now, he had a choice. He could walk away. Swallow the injustice. Pretend it never happened. Or he could fight back. Malcolm clenched his jaw, his mind made up. He wasn't going to let them win. Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, the citation in front of him. His fingers traced the edges of the paper, his mind replaying every moment from the station, the handcuffs, the smirk on Bradley's face, the cold dismissal of his rights. He could still hear Bradley's voice in his head. "That's how the system works, Mr. Carter." For years, Malcolm had told himself that if he worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and followed the rules, he'd be safe. But now, sitting in his own home with the weight of this injustice pressing down on him, he saw the truth. The system wasn't broken, it was designed this way. A spark of defiance burned in his chest. He wasn't going to let this slide. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a name, Troy Bennett. Troy was an old friend from college, now an attorney known for taking on cases of racial discrimination and police misconduct. They hadn't spoken in a while, but Malcolm knew Troy would understand. He hit call. "Malcolm?" Troy's voice was surprised but warm. "Man, it's been a minute. What's up?" Malcolm exhaled sharply. "I need your help." The next morning, Malcolm walked into the downtown law office where Troy worked. It was a modest but busy space, filled with stacks of legal briefs and buzzing phones. Troy met him in the lobby, shaking his hand firmly. "I read your text. Tell me everything." They sat in a private office, and Malcolm laid it all out, every detail of the stop, the arrest, the fabricated obstruction charge. As he spoke, Troy's expression hardened. "This is textbook harassment," Troy said when Malcolm finished. "Bradley knew what he was doing. He wanted to remind you that he has the power." Malcolm nodded. "And I want to fight it." Troy leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "We can contest the charge, sure. But we need more than just your word against his." Malcolm's stomach tightened. He hadn't thought about that. "Dashcam?" he asked. Troy smirked. "Now you're thinking like a lawyer. Officers are supposed to have their dashcams and body cams recording during stops. We can file a motion to request the footage." Malcolm felt a flicker of hope. "And if it proves I didn't resist?" Troy's eyes gleamed. "Then we've got them." Days passed, filled with legal motions and paperwork. Troy filed an official request for the footage, forcing the department to respond. At first, they delayed. Excuses piled up. Technical issues. Processing backlog. Malcolm knew exactly what they were doing. They were stalling. But then, a breakthrough. Troy called late one evening. They sent over the dashcam footage. His voice held an edge of excitement. "Meet me at my office first thing tomorrow." Malcolm barely slept that night. The next morning, he and Troy huddled around a laptop screen. The footage played in crisp detail, his car pulling to the side of the road, Bradley approaching, the entire encounter unfolding exactly as Malcolm remembered. And then, the crucial moment. Malcolm's hands were in plain sight. He moved slowly. He asked for an explanation. Bradley's claim that Malcolm resisted was a blatant lie. Troy grinned. "This is it. We take this to court, and they'll have no choice but to drop the charge." Malcolm's relief was immediate, but something inside him still burned. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly. "How many others has Bradley done this to? How many people don't have a lawyer, don't get the footage in time, don't get justice?" Troy studied him. "What are you thinking?" Malcolm clenched his jaw. "I don't just want the charge dropped. I want him exposed." Troy nodded slowly, understanding. "Then we don't just fight this in court. We take it to the public." The next day, the video was online. Troy leaked it to a journalist who had covered cases of police misconduct before. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. Comments flooded in. "They really arrested this man for nothing. That cop knew exactly what he was doing. How many more times does this have to happen?" The pressure mounted. By the time Malcolm and Troy arrived at the courthouse for his hearing, the media was already there. Cameras flashed as Malcolm walked up the steps, his chin high. Inside, the judge barely looked at him as she reviewed the evidence. Then, with a curt nod, she spoke the words Malcolm had been waiting for. "The charge is dismissed." A breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaped his lips. But the real victory came later that night. A breaking news alert popped up on his phone. Officer Bradley placed on administrative leave pending investigation into multiple misconduct complaints. Malcolm exhaled, a slow, steady breath. For the first time in days, he felt something close to peace. But he wasn't done yet. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The video had done more than just clear Malcolm's name, it had ignited something bigger. News outlets picked up the story. Activists called for an investigation. People started coming forward with their own encounters with Officer Bradley. Malcolm sat in Troy's office, scrolling through messages on his phone. Dozens of strangers had reached out, some thanking him, others sharing their own horror stories. "I knew Bradley was bad," Troy said, leaning back in his chair, "but I didn't realize how many people he's harassed." Malcolm nodded, his jaw tight. "It's a pattern. He's been doing this for years, and the department let him get away with it." Troy smirked. "Not anymore." Just then, his office phone rang. He picked up, listening intently before his eyebrows lifted in surprise. "That was the reporter we worked with," he said, hanging up. "Bradley's facing an internal affairs investigation. His past complaints are being reopened." Malcolm's heart pounded. "You think they'll fire him?" Troy hesitated. "Maybe. But the system protects guys like him. It won't be easy." Malcolm exhaled slowly. He wasn't naive. One bad cop losing his badge wouldn't fix everything. But it was a start. A week later, the city held a press conference. Malcolm watched from home as the police chief stood at the podium, his expression stiff. After reviewing the evidence, the chief said, "Officer Bradley has been terminated from the department, effective immediately." Malcolm's hands clenched into fists, this time, not in frustration, but in something close to triumph. It wasn't just about Bradley. It was about every time Malcolm had been told to stay quiet, to not make trouble, to just accept the way things were. He had refused. And he had won. His phone buzzed. A message from Troy. "Justice. Not perfect, but real. You did that." Malcolm exhaled, a slow smile forming. No, the fight wasn't over. But today, he had made a difference. If this story resonated with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start conversations that matter and that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right.